Welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience podcast. I am the host, Gaut Einvoll. The fields of computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence, AI, have developed together and benefited from each other since the start of AI in the mid 1950s. The convolutional neural networks that are key ingredients in AI image recognition systems are, for example, very much motivated by discoveries done in the visual system of cats. If you want to hear more about this joint development, you can listen to the previous podcast with Terry Sinofsky, number 9 in this podcast series. But recently, the arrow also goes the other way, as AI tools are increasingly used by computational neuroscientists in their studies of neural systems. The term neuro AI is used for such activities where the goal is either to improve AI systems by drawing inspiration from the brain or advancing our understanding of the brain by using AI. We had 2 podcasts a few months ago reporting from a neuro AI workshop on a boat outside Norway. The term foundation model was coined in 2021 by AI researchers at Stanford University in California. This term referred to machine learning models that is trained on huge datasets and can be applied across a wide range of cases, especially after having been fine-tuned to a specific task. A large language model like GPT is an example of a foundation model. Over the last years, the group of Andreas Tolias, now at Stanford also, has worked on developing foundation models for the mouse visual cortex. In a preprint on bioRxiv with Eric Wang as a first author, a foundation model is presented trained on optical responses recorded from 135,000 neurons in 14 awake and behaving mice, all watching natural movies. Optical responses here means calcium signals measured with 2-photon imaging. In the podcast, Andreas explains how the foundation model was made, how it was able to make accurate predictions of optical responses even to new types of stimuli, and how it with limited new training could be tuned to predict responses for new mice. We also talk about a nice, impressive application where the foundation model was applied on data from the so-called microns mouse, where predictions from a foundation model trained on optophysiological data could be validated with anatomical reconstructions of dendritic structures of neurons measured using electron microscopy. Finally, we also talk about how foundation models for the brain can be used to learn about the circuit level mechanisms and also aid in the development of treatments for brain diseases, and maybe even also help to improve foundation models outside the domain of neuroscience. If you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/theoretical neuroscience podcast and choose a membership of your liking, for example, at the cost of $1 per month. As a member, you will get access to a video version of the podcast recordings, as well as transcripts to each episode. And note that there is a 7-day free trial period when you sign up. After a suggestion by one of the listeners, I have now made a YouTube channel called Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast, where you also can watch the videos. I will be most grateful if you become a Patreon supporter to help me fund the production of the podcast, even if you're not too interested in looking at the videos. But I also appreciate all the other listeners, and I hope that all of you can help spread the word about the podcast to other people in the community, on social media or otherwise. Okay, here is Andreas. So, welcome to the podcast, Andreas Tolias.
Hi, nice to be here with you,
Here.
Gaute.
Yeah, it's fun. Actually, we go way back. Actually, what happened here?
Oh no, it was someone text, but I'll quit it.
Okay, that's good. That's the sound of podcast.
Yeah,
So anyway, no, I just remember we met in some kind of bus line
yeah,
that was I don't know, very accidental. I don't know exactly why we hooked up because there were many people you could hook up with within in the bus line. But anyway, so that was good. So, but first, I thought, I mean, this podcast is going to be a lot on this foundation models that you're working on. But I thought first, maybe you could sort of tell a little bit more general about what you do.
yeah. So my lab studies the neocortex, more specifically visual perception, decision making in the and learning in the brain, in the neocortex in particular, focusing on vision. And we study this in mice and monkeys. And we also try and use machine learning and AI tools to build models, and more recently, as you alluded to, foundation models,
Mhm.
to try and really understand the representational level principles of visual perception, visual decision making, and things related to vision.
Mm. So yeah, so this important term foundation model is not something that you have invented. It's actually it's a term that is used in AI, right? So
Yeah.
so what is a foundation model in general?
So foundation model, there was a white paper written a couple of years ago by a large group of people. It was started. One of the main authors was Percy Liang from Stanford, and the general idea, is really to embrace large scale data. So let's say you're trying to solve a problem that you may not have as much data in trying to solve it, either because it's just too energy expensive to collect label data, or it's just you don't have enough data. And what you
Mm,
do is you find another domain where there's a lot of data and it's relatively cheap to get, either, let's say, and I'll give the classical example, is text,
mm,
right? And now you come up with a way to essentially learn from all these unlabeled data or large data.
mm,
And what people found empirically, once you learn from this very large data, then you can fine tune it, or in some cases, even with zero shot. That means, you can immediately apply to another problem where you didn't have a lot of data to train
mm,
it
mm.
necessarily.
Yeah.
So another way of thinking about it is, there's, Richard Sutton's bitter lesson, which said, basically deep learning is embracing data and not human ingenuity in terms of hypothesis.
Mm,
Sort of again the same thing. Like, the idea is that it seems right now, from an empirical point of view, although, let's say, from a normative point of view, I'm not sure anybody really understands why it works so well, is that you get a lot of data in a domain, that you have them, then you train this basic model to do some prediction or some task. Usually it's an unsupervised learning task,
mm,
and then you can fine tune it to a lot of downstream problems. So
mm,
it can be applied to a lot of downstream problems. And the classic example is large language models. Large language
mm,
models, you want to, like, build an AI system that you can converse with. It can have a lot of knowledge, can create stuff. It's a generative model. What they found out is that, which is quite remarkable, that it would work to some extent, if you take all the internet and you just train it to do next word or next token prediction, then it learns a general enough representation that with some fine tuning, it can then start to be
mm,
to be reasonable, and it can solve many problems. Like, you can talk to it about science, law, medicine. Now, it's not as simple as that, because although a lot of these companies don't release their model, if you look at just what they call the pre-trained model, which is the model that is
mm,
trained on next token or next word prediction,
mm,
that actually doesn't come across as being very coherent in a way that you would accept it as a very intelligent model. So it does
mm,
need this extra supervision, but even there, it's still very generic. It's not like it seems that if you just have a lot of the brute force sort of supervision to optimize it further, then it still is very good at many tasks. So
mm,
that's the sort of general concept: is you find a domain where you have a lot of data, you put a
mm,
lot of data together, you train a model. And then there is another aspect to it called multimodal foundation model, where you
mm,
can combine modalities together. And I think we'll talk more about that
mm.
as it portrays to the brain.
Sure. So exactly. So if you go back to this large language model, I mean, then you have this foundation model is maybe it's not necessarily like Chat GPT is based on a foundation model, but maybe trained on top of that. Is that sort of the thing
Well,
that
no,
it's?
I mean, ChatGPT is a large language model that is essentially
Mm,
is trained on a foundation model. I mean, you
mm,
can think of it as a foundation model in the sense that it takes a lot of text, which
mm,
you can think of it as, humans, of course, generated the text, right? So it took 2,000 years or more to generate thousands to generate all the
yeah,
human text, right?
yeah,
So it's not like when we say these things, they learn from humans, obviously, in
mm,
this case.
mm,
And then he was trained to essentially predict the next word.
mm,
Now, if you think about it, it may sound like why would something learn basic concepts by just predicting the next word? But human language is a very efficient way to compress very complex information, right? That's why we
mm,
can communicate, with a few words, a lot of meaning, right? Whereas vision, for example, is a high bandwidth signal, but it's very high dimensional and probably more
yeah,
complex, right?
mm,
So language has humans developed a way to basically describe the world model or the world in a compact way.
mm,
So it seems that because we've generated a lot of this text, there's like the whole internet, and we had the technology to put it somewhere where someone could use it. It wasn't like, very expensive to go and go to all the world libraries and do it. You could just like take stuff from the internet. Then it created this basic model called the foundation model. And then with with human supervision, and there's two stages of human supervision that they use, but basically get humans to supervise it through human feedback, to say things that look reasonable both
mm,
conceptually, and also they fine tune it to be, let's say, more politically correct, or to say things that are not
mm,
obnoxious and insulting to people. Then it can perform many tasks.
mm, mm,
Now, the other thing is that these models can be stitched together with other modalities. And that's how some of these video generation stuff that just came out, even in the last couple of weeks, that look very impressive, like VO2 from Gemini, from DeepMind, Google DeepMind,
okay.
and Sora to some extent.
So what does it do? What do they do?
Well, basically, you can then there's the language foundation model, and then there's a video foundation model, and they're stitched together. Now
Mm,
you can generate video from language. You can say, for example, throw two people in a podcast
mm,
discussing,
yeah,
something, and then it looks like photorealistic. Or you can, and that again is the concept that there's a lot of video out there on YouTube, and there and there's that seems to be a bit more complicated how to do it
mm,
than language, but
mm,
people are making a lot of progress in now, for example, using video to build foundation models, and then again with some stitching together and probably reinforcement learning, sorry, some kind of learning,
mm,
human feedback learning, then you get it to perform a lot of tasks. um, so generally speaking, is you can think of it as, if you want to solve a problem A and you don't have enough data or
mm,
expertise to do it, solve a problem B where you have more data that is related to A, and
mm.
then transfer it to A,
Exactly. So
right?
you build on the information that you extract from A, and then
Yeah,
supplement with this little bit of data from B, and suddenly you have something that.
yeah. I mean, before this term foundation model came out,
Mm,
people used terms like transfer learning,
mm,
which was also related to this idea. Like, for
mm,
example, if you wanted to build a system to detect glioblastoma, there's not enough cases out there. So if you train it on, let's say, ImageNet or something where you have more data,
mm,
then you could fine tune it to this
yeah,
other data set.
mm,
It's a bit more, foundation model is a bit more general than that, but it's a similar concept.
mm. So now we're going to, of course, this talk is, or this talk, this podcast is going to be about application of foundation model to, I guess, the visual system of animals. And but there is this, if you think, I guess, sort of the one quite well-known example for the use of these AI networks are these like task-driven models that was sort of developed by, I don't know, it was like Yamins and others. Yeah, there are sort of like where they, I guess, they trained these deep networks, these convolutional neural networks on categorization and essentially on a task, and then sort of looked, well, for one thing, and saw whether this CNN deep network could sort of actually do the same kind of categorization, and then also sort of look at, well, and also then look at the representation that was in this trained CNNs, right? So that was an important discovery or application, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so there the idea was, Dan Yamins and others, Jim DiCarlo and others, there's a bunch of these papers where you take a trained model on, let's say, image classification or categorization task. And the classical one is ImageNet, and you can take something like the original was AlexNet or some other versions now.
Mm,
And then you find that if you want to predict neural responses to images, those models would do better, especially in areas like V4 or IT, than
mm,
the more classical, let's say, pre deep learning models that we were building. Like things that were based more like you start with Gabor filters and you combine them together with more nonlinearities. It was
mm.
hard to build models to predict, let's say, responses in frontotemporal cortex.
Yeah.
Now, always with these models, the glasses half empty, half full, right? They're not perfect, but they're better than anything else we had until now.
Yeah.
So this shows you that there seems to be, to some extent, uh, and another thing that was important early on was that the better the model was at predicting, let's say, the task that it was trained, the better it was at predicting neural responses.
Ah.
Then in the last few years, though, they found that this relationship does not necessarily hold, right? It seems that you're starting to build models that are performing, they're the state of the art in the task, but they're not necessarily better. Sometimes they can even be worse at predicting neurons. So it
Mm,
shows you that there's some divergence, and we'll talk about the two now. But generally speaking, it points out to the fact that deep neural networks, intelligence, can find to some extent common solutions even if the substrate is different, right?
mm,
In the case of the brain, we are trained not to just like classify a million objects into their classes, to 1,000 classes, but we learn through active sensing, through development. We have a genetic code that presets some architecture. So, in different species have this to different extent, how they learn. But the bottom line is that there are some commonalities between the representations of these different systems.
mm,
Um, eh, Now, so that's the general concept of a task-driven model, and you could then combine that with foundation model for vision, and people are trying to build this, as I was telling you earlier, with video, for example. And
mm,
then you can see, okay, now how well do these models predict responses to, let's say, complex video, natural video,
mm.
when we record from different stages of the visual system of a primate, let's say. So that is the
Yeah.
idea here.
Yeah. Because, and then I think so. I remember very well reading your sort of like your data more, I mean, not task driven, but sort of data driven
Yeah.
paper with this inception loops paper in from, I guess, 2019.
Yes.
So that was a difference. Instead of starting with a task, you started with vast amount of, I guess, like a measurement of neural responses recorded with like optical physiology, right? Calcium
Yeah.
imaging.
Yeah.
Mm,
So the idea here was that early on, when Dan and others were doing this, I mean, and it basically the amount of data we had from experimental neuroscience was limited, and
mm,
it still is in primates actually, compared to, I think, what we will be seeing in the next few years because
mm,
of technology. Basically, it's just very hard to get data from the brain. Now,
mm,
in mice with two photon imaging, and a lot of this because of funding from the Brain Initiative. We've developed technologies. I mean, this is the remarkable thing that happened in the last 10 years. In neuroscience, we've developed technologies that are unprecedented in our ability to scale up our data collection.
Mhm.
For example, now there are, you know, routinely many labs record 5 to 10,000 neurons with optical methods, specifically, particularly in mice. And there are microscopes like my collaborators and good colleague and friend Ali Pasha Vaziri's microscope that can record the light beam microscope maybe up to 1 million neurons.
Ah,
Okay, now you know of course one has to trade off between how well isolated these neural recordings are and how contaminated, but generally speaking it's a revolution in data collection. So
mm,
what can be done now, and this is what we did with that paper in 2019 and some newspapers before that, is we basically said, okay, let's just try and build models that are completely data driven without making assumptions about what the right task specifically for mice is, because unlike monkeys, we don't really know as much about what the mice's computational goals of their visual system is. It
mm,
may not be as much about object recognition, but more about navigation and other stuff, or
mm,
maybe detecting specific objects like predators or prey and stuff like that, like crickets, for example. They hunt crickets. So it
mm,
may not be as a generic object recognition system. So
mm,
what we did there is like we recorded these very large data sets and built these data-driven models.
mm,
And the goal there, instead of the loss function being it's the same thing, it's a neural network. It can be even the same architecture, convolutional neural network. Its input is the same, its images in this case. But instead, and it could be the same images, even ImageNet. But
mm,
instead of putting the loss in doing object classification, you put the loss in predicting the neural activity.
yeah,
And then you can go the other way around. You can then say, once I've trained this model just to replicate the representations of the, let's say, the entire macaque visual system,
mm,
then how good is it doing all the tasks that the monkey does, like object recognition, segmentation,
mm,
detecting different types of motions, optic flow, and so forth. So these are the sort of two things. You have data driven and object and task driven.
mm. Yeah, because I mean, then, I mean, in terms of, because I've been sort of well, and I mean, this, if you look at like the primary visual cortex V1, that's where you have had a long tradition of making sort of like Gabor filters, like this kind of filter models, which are often linear, and there has been some kind of some like non-linear variations of it, where you some linear filters, and it's been so people have tried to model these responses for a long time, and your approach just outcompeted all these other approaches in terms of how accurate you could predict things.
Yes. So because of these, I mean, these models, they're very powerful. Neural networks are universal function approximators. So given that these models, it's, and that's an empirical question, right? Because there's a trade-off between having a very very powerful model and overfitting the data versus generalizing, right? And generalizing. So it seems like the models, after you've optimized them in terms of the number of layers and stuff like that, they outperform the more classical LNP type of models
Mm.
with the Gabor type of models.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, you can see why. Because in the mouse, for sure, these neurons, and this is what we did with these inception loop experiments, where we optimized stimuli for individual neurons in the mouse, and we found that most of them were not well described by Gabor filters, but they
Mm.
have these more complex patterns that they detect. So it made sense that, but even in that the Gabor model wouldn't be a very good model, and that was a big effect in the mouse. In the monkeys, it's also outperforms it, but in the monkey, a lot of these neurons are well captured by Gabor filter. So in the
Mm.
monkey, it's a bit better. But then the nonlinearities can be
Mm.
more complex. So the deep neural network can learn Gabor filters, but also it can learn the more complex nonlinearities in a more print in a more general way that then can outperform the classical models.
Mm,
The question then becomes interpretability, right? Because in science, basically neural networks, you can think of it as a very powerful way to copy a complex function, and then if you regularize it correctly and you figure out how to smooth it in a way, it can generalize very well. Although there are problems. For example,
mm,
a lot of these neural networks are not right now in AI, they're not very good at generalizing too well outside their training distribution, and they're
mm,
prone to things like adversarial attack. But generally speaking, if you figure out how to do it, they become very powerful. Then the next question that neuroscientists care about, but also people in AI, is this issue of interpretability. So, for example, and you're a physicist, so this is probably
yeah,
close to your heart, right?
absolutely.
So, you
Mm,
could have a neural network, you can have a model that is much more predictive, like a deep neural network, than one that, let's say, a more classic Gabor filter model or a sparse coding model, you
mm,
know, that is more normative, let's say. But now
mm,
you have this trade-off between interpretability and predictability. And
mm,
ideally, you want to have both. Like you want to have the best powerful model in predicting, but also one that is interpretable,
yeah.
so we humans can understand it,
Mm,
or we can write down some math, or there is some inner understanding of, instead of just being a black box model.
mm. So this I remember. Yeah. So this paper then from 2019, I think that there the network was trained on like a few thousand images, not
Yeah,
movies, right? So that was, and I guess then, I mean, I guess the applicability to, I mean, I guess it applied well to like simple stimuli like dots and drift. Well, at least sort of, well, other static images, maybe simpler static images, but it was not trained to deal with well, certainly movies, right? That came
yeah, yeah.
later.
So that model, in fact, that original model in 2019 was trained on static natural images.
Mm,
And most of the experiments in that paper, in fact, all of the experiments in that paper were trained on 5,000 natural images, and
mm,
then about and recording about 5,000 neurons. And then there was about 100 images that were repeated many times. There was the test images, but they were all natural. We never tested in detail that model to more parametric stimuli,
parametric, then you mean like dots or
like dots
yeah,
or gradings and stuff
yeah.
like that. I mean, we did it in subsequent papers,
Uh,
but this more recent foundation model that is on bioarchive, that was
mm,
trained on many mice and movies,
mm,
one of its advantages that we found is ability to start predicting things outside the natural movie, in this case distribution, including static images, but also things like coherent random dots,
uh,
other kinds of stimuli.
So because that was sort of, I mean, if you sort of look at this, of course, this paper that the preprint you have on bioarchive, Wang et al. So that's what really is striking is I mean that you really use a lot of data. That the amounts of data, I think you said, recorded optical responses from I was at 135,000 neurons of
Yeah.
14 awake and behaving mice to movies, not images, right?
Yes.
So you had much longer recordings and that quantitative difference made a sort of a qualitative difference, right? Almost.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. I
Yeah.
think at the end of the day, so far,
Mm,
and in machine learning, you know, in AI, and the big companies are particularly, I mean, the whole community is very sensitive to this. They call it the scaling laws.
mm,
And there is two main scaling laws. One is data and the size of the model. And they
mm,
have to be like going hand in hand. So if you look now so far, until I think the last 6 months, maybe, where they think they've saturating this, they call it the scaling law of training data,
mm,
is they just use more and more data and larger models, and they get this improvement. Now, of course, this improvement if you look at it, it's in a logarithmic scale. So even like when you keep getting improvement, you need maybe 5, 10 times as much data to get a few percent of improvement.
Mm,
But this is the scaling law, and in neuroscience we do not know exactly the scaling laws yet. We have a little bit analysis done in that one paper and also an earlier paper with my collaborator Fabian Sin and others for
mm,
static images. But it seems now that we're getting enough data and we're doing a new project in mice where we have way more data. We're taking all the data we've collected the last few years to measure the scaling laws, and we want to do something similar in monkeys soon. So the
okay.
question is, how good can these models become if
Mm,
you just throw more and more data
mm.
at them, and when do they start saturating?
And okay, so how, and then you measure success. I mean, you have a quantitative way to measure success in terms of how accurate you predict the responses, optical responses, and for a wide variety of applications, maybe, or something.
Yes. So the classical thing is, you record the activity from some neurons, let's say to natural movies, and you predict for those same neurons how well they respond to new movies,
Mm,
which is called the test set. That's
mm,
the classical measurement of success.
mm,
But because we're trying to build this more foundation model, we want to see how well it generalizes outside this more restricted regime. So we do a couple of things. The first is we see how well does it generalize to new neurons from new mice, right?
yeah.
The idea here is that all mice are similar.
Mm,
So if we needed, and I can tell you specifically, let's say more than an hour, let's say an hour and a half to get a certain level of performance to
mm,
record data. If you take this one new mouse, you
mm,
take 5,000 neurons, let's say you need 1.5 hours of recording
mm,
movies to build a model to reach a certain level of performance, which is its performance on new test movies.
mm,
If we use the foundation core, the one that was pre-trained and not even fine-tuned at all, we just train it on a
mm,
different cohort of mice, let's say
mm,
8 mice,
yeah,
and we just feed a linear readout.
yeah,
Then with maybe 15 minutes of data or 20 minutes of data, we
uh,
can get the same level of performance.
yeah,
So this shows you that now you have sample efficiency, right? If you wanted to to close loop experiments, or you wanted to do manipulation,
mm,
or in the future, if you use this in humans,
mm,
where let's say during an operation, you only have 15 minutes to get the data. If you
mm,
have a very strong foundational core, it would be as if you were recording maybe for an hour and a half or whatever.
mm,
Okay. So this depends on the thing. So that's the one very important thing, how well it generalizes to new neurons and new mice. The other one, how well does it generalize to new stimulus domains, right?
mm,
Because the idea of a foundation model is that you want to understand, it's the way you use, let's say, large language model, and it's being deployed. Everybody comes up with a different question, right? The idea is that you don't want to predetermine what is going to get asked to do, right? And you want it to do it correctly. Now, of course, we can, and this is an open question, how much is everything that we ask, let's say ChatGPT or Gemini or one of these large language models, really outside its training distribution? Because maybe we humans, language is a compressed way of it's a way of compressing information so well that there's not that much you know
mm,
novel entropy that we can generate. But of course there is, but people are trying to break these models like that. But the general idea is that in vision, if you say, okay, I have a good
mm,
foundation model, then you should be able to download it and run in silico experiments under new stimulus conditions that
yeah,
I haven't necessarily trained it. And what we did in that model, we did some classical ones like coherent random dots, flashing
mm,
dots, and stuff like that to see how well it generalized. And there it also generalized very well compared to if it was not the foundation model, it was only trained on one mouse. Okay.
mm,
And the other thing that we did, we said, okay, what about if we go in a different domain completely? Okay. And and there we looked at the model, how well it could because we used this very unique data set that we collected as part of the Microns project of IR funded, again part of the brain
mm,
initiative. This was in collaboration with Baylor College of Medicine, the Allen Institute, and Princeton University. And there we had about 60,000 pyramidal neurons where we have the detailed morphology and connectivity. It was through electron microscopy, connectomics,
Mm.
and the functional activity. So now this foundation model gave us like a functional barcode for each neuron
Mm.
because of the
So
way it was.
just to make sure. So then you do this. So you okay. So you have this. Okay. So you have this microns. You do all this optophysiology on this microns network, and you can identify these different neurons, and then you can and then you can. So then how do you make? Can you make contact with that to the EM reconstruction so that this particular neuron is what we measure here corresponds to this particular neuron in this EM dataset?
Yeah, so let me explain how the experiment was done. It may be
Yeah.
easier. So first, we
Yeah.
did functional imaging over a
Mhm.
long period of time to tile about a millimeter cube of the mouse visual cortex.
Mhm.
And this included V1 and higher visual areas in the mouse like RL, LM, and so on.
Mhm.
Then this mouse was shipped to the Allen Institute,
Mhm.
and they did electron microscopy. And then this whole thing was this volume was stitched together. It was segmented by Princeton, and now in that same volume we have both the functional neurons imaged and the electron microscopy data,
Mhm.
and then we aligned them together. This
Okay.
is a collaboration with the Allen Institute, and a student
Mm.
of mine here built a team with to basically align the data together, and we
Mhm.
align like the 60,000 neurons. So for every
Okay.
neuron we have functional data. We know
Mhm.
exactly where that neuron is in the its corresponding neuron in the electron microscopy volume.
Yeah.
And right now we don't have the full connectome. This is the big bottleneck of connectomics. It's
Mm.
just right now,
Neurons.
it's only a few thousand of neurons
Mm.
have the full axons
Mm.
reconstructed. But we have the morphology, the dendritic morphology.
Mhm.
And what we could show is that we could predict basically pyramidal neurons. They go from layer 2 to layer 6, and the Allen Institute did some morphological classification and said didn't split into different let's say morphological cell types
Mhm.
based on anatomical criteria like
Mhm.
dendritic morphology, some nuclear characteristics, and other stuff. And
Mhm.
then this model that was trained to predict neural activity could also predict the cell type characterization.
Yeah.
Now, the ability to predict it may not be completely surprising because if a lot of the functional characterization, sorry, the morphological comes from the fact that they reside in different layers. And
Mhm.
we know that different layers should have different properties. But we did some controls that it could even do it a little bit beyond that. So it was capturing something about the relationship between structure and function,
Mm.
basically, at the level of
Mm.
morphology.
So the idea is that then you can do this like this optical imaging of the physiology, and at the same time and get out information about the morphological properties of the neurons that you're recording from,
Yes.
because this was sort of like a ground truth data
Yes.
set and some set anatomy.
Exactly.
Oh, really, really cool. So but what is the sort of, there was some kind of, what was the structure of this foundation, like the whatever, the ANN, the applied neural network, is that what we call it, foundation model? I mean, it has some modules and stuff.
Yeah. So basically, at the core, there was two main versions, and they're both in that paper. One was essentially a convolutional neural network that had different versions, or one class of models was a convolutional neural networks with also, uh, some convolutions in time. You had like 3D
Mm.
convolutions to take into account because it was
So
a
that was like,
movie.
so
Also,
two.
some recurrency between the layers. And so it was basically the convolution is a very strong inductive bias for the visual system because we know that receptive fields they tend to tile visual space. So it's a very efficient way
Mm.
of learning representations. And then you had to like, it wasn't just static anymore. It had to have dynamics, and those dynamics were expressed either through 3D convolution or with some recurrence.
So that's like
Then we
2D space and one D time, sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we also tried a transformer architecture,
Yeah.
and that also did very well. But the bottom line here
Mm,
is that, it's possible that with a lot of optimization, one may be better than the other, the architecture. But
mm,
generally speaking, the data is what determines the power of the model by far, at least these models.
yeah.
And it's very hard to say, this architecture is a bit better than the other, especially when the effects are small, because it takes us, the amount of time that the person, like in this case, Eric Wang, took to optimize, let's say, the 3D convolutional neural network, or the one with, LST. One had like more recurrent LSTMs that were convolutional, or the other one had a transformer architecture,
Mm,
can matter in terms of saying, oh, this is 1% better than the
yeah.
other, right?
Yeah.
So,
It
but
wasn't.
generally speaking, all these architectures, if you spend enough effort
Mm,
to figure out the right hyperparameters and get them to train, a lot of these architectures, you just use them off the bat, they will not start training very well. But once you
mm.
find a good training regime, so
Okay.
the training loss goes down, then they tend to be, to a large part, equally well
Mm.
performing.
So you should, you should rather spend the time recording more data than.
Yeah, in some ways getting more data, but then it also start depending on the scaling loss,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Sure. Yeah.
you need to, you may be saturating,
Mm,
so maybe you have to get different types of data and stuff like
mm.
that.
Because but you had some. I saw like a perspective. We had four modules: perspective module. Well, I'm just reading your paper here.
Yeah.
Perspective module and the modulation module, and then you had the real
Yes.
thing, the core, and there's are like the readout at the end. So the perspective model. So why did you? That was sort of
Yeah,
to.
so the perspective module was basically a way to take into account the curvature of visual space and the fact
Mm,
that we had a flat monitor.
mm,
So Eric built a module that you could learn the optimal transformation of the flat monitor space into a curved space,
yeah.
basically. And
Mm,
that had a small but significant effect, but it was a small effect.
mm,
Then the modulation module
mm,
is very important, because this module, these neural networks, and this is true for all the data driven models we've built so far, the neural activity is not just a function of the visual input, but also the behavior of the animal.
yeah.
We know from our work and others that, for example, the pupil, when it dilates,
Mm,
it changes the brain state of the animal, and the way it responds to visual stimuli changes. This is not just like by allowing more light to come in. This
mm,
has to do with an internal neuromodulatory state that
mm,
takes place.
mm. Yeah.
And also running changes. Chris Neal and Stryker discovered this some years ago now, right? So this may be a difference to the monkey, where
Mm,
V1 at least is much more sensory. It seems in
mm,
the mouse it's more like already multimodal between sensory and motor, strong
yeah.
in a stronger way.
Mm,
So the modulator is basically learning how to modulate the responses
mm,
based on the pupil dilation, the running, but also there's a shifter network that takes into account, the eye movements, because the
mm,
mice, you cannot train them to be perfectly fixated. They don't make many eye movements, but sometimes they do. So you record those eye movements, you try and figure out what is the equivalent shift in visual angle that I have to generate
mm,
during, when I'm predicting the responses. So
mm,
then I get a better model.
yeah.
And then there is the visual core, which is all these convolutions mainly and some
Mm,
recurrence in between them.
mm,
And then the neurons get a linear readout. So basically, you learn the entire function.
mm,
You say, all these neurons, I'm going to learn one big nonlinear function to
mm,
go from the visual input, the eye movements, the pupil dilation, and the running,
mm,
and I'm going to learn feature maps that then every neuron is going to have its own linear readout. So basically, plus some output nonlinearity. So basically, you learn these, as a combined model, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. Like V1, for example, it's not like every neuron is completely different, right?
Mm,
And in the mouse is even more dramatic, that the differences between early visual areas and high visual areas are not as dramatically different than what you see in the monkey, for example, between V1 and V4 or
mm.
IT.
I see. Yeah. So how does this readout? Because when you sort of compare, I mean, well, so what you get out from the model is obviously this, some sense these output units, and then you say that this should be that's some kind of linear combination, the weight, linear weight, linear weighted sum of these output units in your model should correspond to the response of one of them recorded neurons.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, you can think of it as the last layer of this neural network.
Mm,
It's some convolutional layer that has many feature maps,
mm,
say hundreds of them.
uh,
And then you can think of this as a 3D tensor.
mm,
And then each neuron finds a location. It's a bit more complicated, but the simplest
mm,
way to think about it finds a location where is the center of its receptive field. And then it weighs those features that it likes the best, or the
mm,
ones that are optimal for us to predict that neuron the best in response to natural images. And each neuron
mm,
has a different weighted sum of these feature maps. And
mm,
let's say if this is 1,000 feature maps, now
mm,
you can think of each neuron as a point in terms of its feature selectivity in a 1,000-dimensional space.
mm,
And it's like a functional barcode that, given that
mm,
networks weights and
mm,
nonlinearities, it represents how this neuron will respond.
mm. And
um,
and this barcode will stay the same for the same neuron in the same mouse for the during the experiment, right?
yeah, this
In
is an assumption, of
Yeah,
course, right?
yeah,
There is no.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, that's sort of what is. But of
Yes,
course, for a new mouse, this is completely different.
yes,
Yeah, and then it
exactly.
has to be. Yeah. So I saw that you sort of in to make this what do you call the foundation core. You had 14 mice, and you used data from eight mice to make like the foundation core. Is that then you're talking about the core module or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically, you train. You take these 8 mice, and now you put all the data together, and now you train this end to end, and you
Mm,
predict. I think it was, let's say, more than 60,000 neurons or something from these
mm,
8 mice. I think 66,000 euros. So now you just take the model and you train it with, the perspective, the modulator, the convolutional filters, the linear readout for these 66,000 neurons.
mm,
And now you've trained this, and now you chop off all the 66, the linear readout. Now
mm,
you take the pre-trained model, you freeze it. You don't
uh,
have to train it anymore. And
uh,
now in new mouse, you just feed the linear readout. So
okay.
now it becomes like the task-driven model of Dan, Yamins. But now, instead of being trained in a task
Mm,
where humans were labeling, let's say, the object classes, it
mm,
was trained to predict neural activity, and now it's still frozen and locked. You
mm.
don't fine tune it anymore. I mean, this is the most basic
The
way
core,
to do
yeah.
it, and you
Mm.
just feed the new neurons.
And then you sort of want to apply it to a new mouse, and then of course you need less data. That's what you said. And then what aspect of the so then you only train this perspective and module and these other
Yeah,
modules and the readout or
some of the like you know basically there's different ways of doing it, but
uh,
you could retrain the perspective and the modulator, because maybe one
mm,
mouse has a different way that it responds to the pupil dilation and stuff like that.
yeah.
But the most difficult thing to train, and the one you freeze, is the core.
Okay.
And whenever you compare it to the baseline is to train everything for the new mouse end to end.
Mm,
you
yeah.
know
Yeah. But it's okay. So of course now when we talk about the large language models, there's a lot of worry about the energy consumption in training models and running models. So, I mean, I guess the most energy, whatever compute consuming part of this project is to train this
yeah.
core. Is that something? Is it something that worries your
Yes.
your university, your energy bill is high, or is it?
Yeah, no, it's a very serious. It's not just that. Is in neuroscience, especially if we start going with electrophysiology,
Mm,
with neuropixels, and if we scale up, I mean, right now, we're not built. Let's say our mode of operation as a community is around individual labs, and no individual lab can collect very large scale data, to make this maybe. Well, let's put it like that. If we were to coordinate a big effort to
mm,
collect a lot of data, even in vision, let's say from the macaque or mouse in more complex tasks, and we were to build what we call digital twins or foundation models of this data.
mm,
A digital twin is basically using the foundation model to build individual
mm,
digital twins of neurons or mice, right? The
mm,
output of the foundation model is the digital twins.
mm.
It We would require a lot of, it's not just the energy, is to buy the compute power.
Okay.
Some back of the envelope calculations we did is that in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, if neurophysiology technology like neuropixels can be scaled up
Mm,
in terms of their neuropixels are these, state of the art depth electrodes that are built by IMEG in Belgium that can record from hundreds or thousands of neurons if you scale them up. Because of the you know you know high temporal resolution and large number of neurons, and if you can do them at scale across many experiments, then we will be starting to be in par with data amounts in terms of, they call these like number of tokens. It's like
oh,
hundreds of billions of tokens, or maybe
oh,
close to a trillion tokens, that some of these large language models, llama 3.4
oh, I
5 or
see.
4, are trained on in the next few years. And that's going to be a serious problem,
Uh,
because you know we'll need the infrastructure to
mm,
scale and train these models,
yeah. Mm,
you
mm.
know
But
um,
this, you're saying that this has been less of an issue for this optical physiology because the time resolution is so much smaller?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Let's say it's doable. The models, of course, we've trained them in at the individual lab level infrastructure, where you
Okay.
have some GPUs that the universities tend to have
Okay.
right now.
So
In
you
one
did all
room.
this in-house in
Yeah,
at
you do
Baylor.
it in house,
Yeah.
right?
Mm,
But I'm saying that
mm,
there is an argument that if this gets scaled up
mm.
to
Yeah.
a bigger thing,
Mm,
few universities have the infrastructure
yeah.
and the resources, and there isn't clear funding mechanisms to do this, because basically if you think about it,
Mm,
companies buy these,
mm,
the GPUs, at
mm.
like, I don't know, I forget now, X AI bought, I think, 10,000 H100. So it's like
Okay.
they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on
Yeah.
GPUs.
Mm,
Now, having said that, there are maybe more efficient ways to train these models.
mm,
It's sort of like, because these companies have a lot of money and a lot of, they've just been buying them, and they're so competitive, they're racing each other.
mm,
Maybe they're not the most optimized infrastructure even to train them. And
mm,
recently, for example, some startups in China have managed to train these models, large language models, with like even 2% of the resources that are used, for example, by big companies like OpenAI and others. So
mm,
it remains to be determined, but this is an issue that I think in neuroscience,
mm,
if we're going to, which I think we should, because
mm.
it's crazy not to. I mean, this is a way to basically try and understand all this massive data we're collecting. Um,
Mm,
we will need mechanisms to have access to this large
mm.
compute power.
But I'm sort of thinking that, I mean, if you have already this, like this your foundation models based on optical physiology, that sounds like you could sort of, that could be a good starting point for training sort of electrophysiological
That's
foundation
a great
models.
question.
Yeah.
And we've done a little bit of that, and you're right. It does, if you take a good foundation model that's trained on optical physiology, it seems preliminarily at least to transfer to even neuropixel data
Mm.
in mice.
Yeah.
Doesn't transfer to another species very well, especially in monkey, because
Mm.
very different, the
Mm.
representations. But there is some, it seems, some
Oh.
transfer across recording
Mm.
modalities.
Mm. Yeah, because I guess the like the optical activity that you measure is some kind of a firing rate ish kind of coarse
Yeah,
grain, yeah, coarse grain in time kind of measure of yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, so thinking if you have now this like your sort of like foundation model, uh, is it do we need to do more experiments of this particular kind now? Is it sort of like the point where okay, we could just use the foundation model, it's good for animal welfare and good for everything?
Yeah, no, I still think we did experiments, but I think the dream scenario is, and we're making this, of course, model publicly available, is people run experiments in the foundation models and in the digital twins. And the advantage here is like you can run them at scale, right? What it would take in, I don't know, hundreds of years or 1,000 years to run in the mouse, if anybody lived long enough and had enough resources, you
Hmm.
can run it like if you have enough GPUs in hours, or because it's just scaling up GPU access, right? But I think it depends on, ultimately, let's say if you and your students use one of these models,
Hmm.
and you make a very profound new discovery. I don't know, you discover some new neural manifold
Hmm.
like your colleagues did with,
Exactly.
with grid cells, or I
Yeah.
don't know, in
Yeah.
the visual cortex of the mouse.
Yeah.
Then the nice thing about it is you can design then a specific experiment
Hmm.
that you could then run with a collaborator that
Yeah.
won't take, so you can do the exploration at scale,
Hmm.
and then you ultimately have to test it, and that's
Sure.
where this inception loop,
Yeah.
you loop back to in a closed
Yeah.
loop way to test the experiment.
Hmm. And also, if I mean, if you like, and as I said, I mean, we are doing sort of like physics type modeling of networks, and I guess sort of, and then you of course also always want to test your models, like network models, against experiments, and then we don't we know we all, I only have to ask you to get some access to your model. I don't need
Yeah,
I don't need, at least at this sort of like first test for a model, right? I guess for like yeah, a first test for a model is to, it's better to test against the foundation model than ask experimentalists, presumably.
yeah, definitely. I think that
Mhm.
um it you can test your ideas in a foundation model. I mean, if you have the right foundation model, and
Mhm.
then even publish your findings with the caveat that someone has to go and test them,
Yeah.
depending
Oh,
on what you find in a,
sure.
in a
But
real
that
experiment.
sort of, but that, I mean, that sort of is like a prediction, right? That's what often comes out of theoretical papers, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is sort of yeah. So it is sort of a almost like a game changer, can be a partial game changer. It can sort of change the way we do science. Obviously, well,
Yes.
yeah, in many ways. So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, but that's all. I mean, I just this. Okay, so you have all this. I mean, you train this your model in house, and then I think is are you going to make it? I think you mentioned something in the paper that will be made available on GitHub when it's published or something. So
Yeah.
is this kind of be in a format where you can, I guess, we download a huge matrix or something? Is that
Yeah.
if you
No,
want
I
to?
mean, what we are trying to do is, publicly release it in a way that it will be useful, and not, because right now it's intertwined into our code
Okay.
base, so makes it, so what we are doing now is extracting the model in a way that it will be
Ah.
fairly straightforward, anybody that knows
Mm.
PyTorch or Python to be able to
Okay.
use it,
Yeah.
and run experiments on it.
Uh-huh.
And also the nice thing about it is that we will also release the digital twin of the Microns mouse. So
Uh-huh.
you could then go back and
Yeah.
run experiments and also look at the anatomy or
Yeah, fantastic.
the morphology of these neurons.
So I think sort of this is a great opportunity for people with great ideas around the world who don't have access to, well, I mean, for if they want to test out ideas on the network action in the mouse. So I mean, maybe you can make something like the chat mouse instead of a chat GPT. Sort of
Yeah, it could be something like that. Yeah,
that
I
would be
like
really
the
cool.
name. Maybe we'll adopt it and call it chat mouse.
So, but anyway, so and now of course this is all about predicting correctly, and but do the if you look, have you looked into the structures, or is it some kind of information inside the train network that tells you anything that resemble like true biological neural networks in the mouse?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question, right? Like how, let's say we build the perfect predictive model,
Mm,
how do we use it scientifically? Because it's mostly an engineering effort, right? Like we basically collecting the
mm,
data,
mm,
using deep learning to build, like to copy it over. So basically it's a way of creating an in silico model of a chunk of the brain
mm,
and how it reproduces the activity dynamics
mm. It's
using a
like
different substrate.
it's like
Because
it's like the perfect test animal in some sense, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now the question is, what do you do with it? And that's
Mhm.
an open question that people debate. On the one hand, people think, if you look at the big discoveries, let's say in neuroscience at the systems level, with the discovery of the receptive field, edge detectors, place cells, phase cells, grid cells, head direction cells, neurons responding to motion. There's this concept that the code and neural code is interpretable to a human, right?
Mm.
Like we could go in or and understand, probably not at the level of a single neuron, but even the single neuron, there's some level of interpretability, but specifically at the population, right? At the
Mm,
dynamics, like there is a code that you could explain
mm,
in words or in math somehow, right? And so basically, because if you think of this neural network, if I say,
mm.
what is this neuron doing, and I tell you, well, it's a point in a thousand dimensional space given very complex nonlinearities,
Ah,
haven't really explained. I mean, I just told
yeah,
you, like, yeah, it's doing something very complicated,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Now, there is a whole field in AI called mechanistic interpretability.
Mm,
I think it's a bit of misfortune. It's called mechanistic because it's not really about mechanism in the way
mm,
that neuroscientists think mechanism.
mm,
But basically, it's a representational level dissect. It's basically doing like neuroscience experiments in a model.
mm,
And it's used in machine learning to figure out what these individual nodes or populations of neurons are doing in these very large models that they have now, like say
mm,
like ChatGPT. So, and you could, for example, what we did in the 2019 paper, and others have done it also, and we've had some other papers on this, is you could, at the level of individual neuron, you can do the Hubble and Weasel experiment and say what's the optimal stimulus to drive these neurons. And then from that, you can, because you visualize it, maybe you can get some interpretability of maybe what these neurons are doing, or or you can study the invariances. We have another paper looking at
mm,
the invariances of these neurons, and invariance, you can study things like equivariance. Like, so basically the ultimate goal is to understand how the latent structure of the world, which
mm,
is in vision, is the objects, there are surfaces, there are
mm,
textures, there are depth, there are poses,
mm,
colors, and so on and so forth, there are motions. How are they encoded in the brain? Is there, let's say, this mapping between the world variables and the neural variables? What is their relationship?
mm,
And there are, like, concepts from neuroscience and psychology, like compositionality, modularity. Are there modules,
mm,
microcolumns, columns, right? So there is a sort of, I would say, patchy understanding of all these things between psychology and neuroscience. But now, if you have a digital twin that enables you to do experiments at scale, in a way that, it's like many, many, many orders of magnitude more. Maybe you can get like a more comprehensive description of the system,
mm,
and then something big will jump out, like, the way the monsters saw grid cells,
yeah,
and then they found the toroidal manifold and stuff like that,
mm,
something that basically relates. It gives us a deep insight of how
mm,
our brain in particular, and the primate brain,
yeah,
has a good world model of the visual world that
mm,
is related to our
yeah,
experience. I
mm,
think that is the holy grail. So
yeah,
interpretability is the key.
yeah,
There's
mm,
another thing, and we can discuss it in a minute, that even if you don't understand that, you could then stitch foundation models at different levels, and then try and relate, for example, activity states to disease states. And
okay.
then you could then start figuring out maybe how to cure diseases or find.
Okay, so how would you do that? Just to be specific. I mean,
Well, for example, let's say you have, I mean, this is like a thought experiment, but let's say you
mm,
have depression, and you understand something about the dynamics of an attractor, that you can say that when, say, you record from areas in the frontal lobe, and you find that when you get these attractor states, that patient is depressed,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Then you can stimulate it electrically, and
mm,
now you can learn how to manipulate these attractors.
mm,
So now you have a digital twin that, let's say, mimics the dynamics of this attractor state, and then how electrical interventions, even pharmacological or whatever, change these dynamics.
okay.
And you
So
have this in
then okay.
silicon.
Mm. So
Then you
then you
can
need.
optimize it. You can
Mm,
find the right stimulation parameters to
mm,
get you into the attractor state that you want, that is
mm,
associated with happiness.
yeah.
And then you could try and test it in a patient. That
Mm,
doesn't mean you understood,
no, no.
everything about the system, but you
Mm,
could manipulate the
yeah,
system.
but I mean, it's also like if you think about our weather forecasts. I mean, I guess from what I mean, they are all computed now, and I don't think they are. And you still have this term, that low pressure front and high pressure front, which helps us to think about it. But I guess at the end of the day, it's just computed the modern weather forecasts. So I guess this thing of having, and it's still, I think, having some of these old ideas and old terms are still useful. Maybe at least that's what the meteorologists, but
Say,
the TV meteorologists, they don't say here's the weather. This is what the computer said. They say something more than that, right?
and that's, I think, what we want, right? Like,
Mm,
ultimately you want, you see, there is another aspect to this,
mhm,
which is, we humans will trust, if everything is completely black box,
mm,
then it becomes harder for us to trust it. And there's an issue in AI. They call this, a lot of people are worried about AI safety.
mm,
Let me give you like a simple example. Let's say you're driving a vehicle, is driving by itself, and the traffic lights break. All of a sudden, someone throws water at the car, and a child runs in with a ball.
mm,
Now, maybe that combination of events has never happened before, and it's very hard to like make sure that every combination ever happened. And a human would just like break,
yeah,
right, or stop, right.
mm,
But an AI system that maybe has not, in a way that we are sure, has disentangled the latent variables, the causal latent variables of the world, right? And it's just like a big black box that the information is,
mm,
more of a connectionist approach, where the information is sort
mm,
of entangled in ways that we don't really understand. Maybe we won't have full faith in such a system. But
yeah,
if we knew that when we looked inside the hood, inside the neural network, there is modules that have clear evidence that they've disentangled these latent variables, then
mm,
it will build more trust in us.
mm,
And one big research area is people trying to figure out how, you can build neural networks that are more interpretable, and they've disentangled. Basically, they learn the world model better, and we think that's going to allow them to generalize better outside their training distribution, and they will be more interpretable,
mm,
and that's easier for us to control and trust.
mm,
And of course, that's tightly linked to this concept that this net, let's say the forecasting,
mm,
I know very little about these
mm.
models, but the idea is that maybe they are related to like what physicists have believed for years
Sure. Mm.
determines weather
Well, it's
patterns.
like pressure and temperature and moisture and
Yeah,
mm,
stuff like that. Yeah.
mm, mm. So I mean, as you said, I mean, this in the well, there's been, of course, this enormous commercial interest in large language models has led to this competition to scale things up, and both in terms of data and in terms of compute power. Uh, so uh, so this it hasn't, and also with, I guess, with your foundation model here, it's sort of built on not any really new ideas in terms of how to make artificial neural networks. It's sort of like just same approach as large language models, more data. And you wrote this interesting paper, I think was this guy Sins in your group,
Yeah.
uh,
Fabian, Sins and
Fabian
others.
Sins, yeah, together with him, engineering a less artificial intelligence, where I guess you talked about this sort of how to get this important term of having a right, or get improve the inductive bias when you sort of want to make like an artificial neural network. So because I guess, yeah. So what is meant by inductive bias?
Yeah. So the inductive bias, as I said earlier, basically the inductive bias is, you can think of it as the bias uh, of the model
Mm,
to learn a more restricted relationship between the input and the output. So you can
mm,
think of, let's say, linear regression. The inductive bias is that the the relationship between x and y is linear, right? A convolutional neural network has an inductive bias that that the information that you're learning to compute something is the same irrespective of the the part of space that is being computed, right?
mm,
In the sense that you need filters that are similar in different parts of space. Let's say a there's other ways. So basically you can think of it as a prior that you put in, that you can think of as a restriction or a
mm,
bias in what you should learn from data. Now the reason that is important is because if you want to like learn the relationship between x and y, it's a trivial problem, especially with neural networks, because you can overfit the data and get the
mm,
your error down to zero, right? So you can, if you become like a lookup table, you just need a powerful enough
mm,
function to learn everything, right? You can
mm,
think of it in the most extreme scenarios like a lookup table, right?
mm,
It's perfect memory.
mm,
The point of learning is generalization. And because of the no free lunch theorem, generalization has to do with giving something away, basically learning a having some prior assumption about the data. And ideally you want some prior assumption about the generation of the data, right?
mm,
What is the true causal structure that has generated the data,
mm,
right? So the inductive bias comes from that.
mm,
Now there's different ways of learning it, and people are trying to do it. And in that paper, we advocate that at least in the next, let's say, few years, the low hanging fruit from a practical point of view is learning the inductive bias of the brain from functional data,
mm,
and less from maybe it's more complicated, we think, to learn it from structural data,
mm,
to build, basically to start introducing complex, you know,
mm,
non-linearity. Basically, biophysical models may be a harder path to extract the inductive bias at this point.
mm,
And bias basically puts restrictions. And if you use it at the biophysical level,
mm,
which I also think is going to be happening,
mm,
it's a bit harder right now. And the reason is because, let's say you have the right inductive bias in terms of the structure of the network,
mm,
but you have to have the right learning rule to match it, to
mm,
even get it to train.
yeah,
So
yeah,
for the classic thing for code spiking networks, we do not have efficient ways to train spiking networks the way we have with deep neural networks now,
mm,
because of we don't know how to backpropagate the gradient, because we use backpropagation. So it happens that backpropagation works very well with optimizing these artificial neural networks that are simpler, they're not biophysical. So this is where the thing is. Now, if ultimately if we want to like represent, because of this concept of universality, right? And we know this now, right? Like there is ChatGPT and you and I speaking,
yeah,
and where you can have a very intelligent conversation with ChatGPT the way you're having with me now, but its substrate is very different, right? It doesn't have spiky, it doesn't have a connectome the way our brains do. It's just a very different substrate, but yet at the representational level, at the behavioral level, is doing something very similar. But because, for example, of Dan Yamin's works and others, we know that if they're doing the same tasks, they also have representational level similarities, right? They both
mm,
have, let's say, they learn Gabor filters, or they learn texture like representations
mm,
that we see both in the brain, like we've studied, let's say, in V4 and others, and you see them in these neural networks, or they have object selective neurons. And maybe the same is for language. People now are doing the same with language recordings. So
yeah,
the general idea here is that the AI right now, its substrate is silicon and artificial neural networks, deep neural networks of different forms, and we have ways to copy the biological activity into this same substrate, and then we can make comparisons and study them like that. Whereas if we go for biophysical models, at least in the next few years, it may be harder to make those links, because right now we don't know how to train biophysical models and get them
mm,
to be as powerful as artificial neural networks. And also that, because of this, there's a lot of redundancy at that level. But I think ultimately, like for
mm,
diseases, for example, if you had a biophysical model that you understood, let's say the
mm,
composition down to the ion channels and the receptors of the neurons, right?
mm,
And you linked it to the representational model and the behavioral model, then you could do, as we were saying earlier, with electrical stimulation and depression, you
mm,
can start testing pharmacological agents to affect specific cell types that then affect the activity that then affects the behavior. Even if we don't need these to build a less artificial intelligence, it doesn't mean that we're building a more intelligent model, but we're building a model and then we can intervene at different levels if we care about, let's say, curing a disease.
mm. Because I guess this, I mean, if you think of of course, well, I mean, all these models that is like you have used in foundation model, there is all this obviously this inductive bias, well, set up by that, well, set up by your choices. It's just that it's very difficult to. We don't have a good handle on the effective inductive bias introduced by different network architectures, do we? That's a difficult connection to
Yeah,
make.
we don't. We
Yeah.
don't understand. I mean, we have things like locality.
Mm,
Like connections tend to be local. We have things like feedback, feed forward, but even that we don't understand what is the inductive bias for that.
no.
So
Yeah.
we don't have a good grasp of
Yeah.
computation and the
Mm,
microcircuit architecture, right?
mm,
At least not in a way that has been useful for AI now, or
mm,
building models that recap. For example, our state of the art models right now in predicting neural activity or behavior are generic neural networks,
mm.
right?
Yeah.
And
So,
yeah,
but maybe I guess if we start now plateauing out the sort of like the scaling up for both practical and maybe like principled reasons, then there's probably might be more information, or maybe more focus. Well, maybe more focus, become more focused on trying to understand this inductive biases better, and maybe to try to do it for
yeah,
more. I mean, that's maybe going to be an interest also for the big companies. Maybe.
could be for sure. I think a a powerful new direction for
Mm,
big companies. I mean, for AI in general,
mm,
is because people think of the internet as the fossil fuel of
mm,
AI,
mm,
right?
yeah.
And we've run out of it. We've exhausted it all.
Yeah.
And now the new thing is they're trying to reuse it
Yeah.
in new ways. There's this new thing called test time inference, where
Mm,
the neural networks spend more time like thinking,
mm,
so they don't, and they're getting the thing in new scaling law there.
yeah.
Although, of course, these companies are very secretive.
Yeah.
These are like more people trying to reverse engineer what they're saying and some researchers in academia. But generally speaking, you know, the fossil fuel of
Mm,
data has been the internet, and we're running out. Of course, there's video, there's a lot of unexplored video, and there's synthetic data that a lot of people are doing, including data curation and trying to like find better data, because not all
sure.
data are equally good, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But there is another fuel, maybe that's even a stronger fuel, which is neural data.
Mm,
And neural data could be activity, for example. It could be
mm,
trying to learn, let's say, in the visual cortex, extracting visual representations from
mm,
brains that may be more robust and more energy efficient because they can learn faster because they have
mm.
a better inductive bias. So maybe you pre-train these models with brain data, or you do code training now,
Oh.
and where you have both task and neural
Mm,
data driven models
mm,
combined together. They are like now being trained on two different dimensions of data, and
mm.
those may end up becoming much more powerful.
You mean
Even
powerful in general, or for only for prediction of neural data?
No, I think in general it could
Okay.
be that these models, for example, so one big hypothesis is that our brains has a world model, right?
Mm,
And that the world model is expressed in neural activation patterns,
mm,
where, for example, the classic thing is, when a child first sees a pink marble elephant statue, it just
mm,
immediately recognizes it. I don't know
mm.
if you've seen these examples of cows on a beach. A neural network has never seen a cow on a beach, says it's a horse,
Yeah.
right? This
Mm,
is the classic example of the lack of generalization. Like, I mean, we don't think a lot of humans have seen a cow on the beach, but
mm,
no human is ever going to miss. The
no.
fact that neural networks confidently say it's a horse
Mm,
shows there's a fundamental problem in the way they
mm,
learn,
mm,
right?
mm.
Now, if the brain's representations in our brain, in your brain, and the
Mm.
monkey's brain, if this entangled shape,
Yeah.
texture, colors,
Yeah.
in a way that is modular,
Yeah.
maybe there's some
Yeah.
dynamics, but
Mm,
it has to do with classical problems in neuroscience, like the binding problem, all this stuff.
mm.
Then, if those are
Yeah.
distilled into an
Ah,
artificial neural network, it won't just become better at predicting brain data, but it may
mm.
also be better at generalizing.
Exactly.
Now,
So, mm,
big tech right now is trying to solve this with a brute force, right? They're just
mm,
saying, okay, let's
yeah.
just collect
Mm,
more and more data, right?
mm. Yeah. So, but now that's sort of like, I mean, the field of neuro AI is, I mean, taking info from neuro to AI. I mean, that's so. This is because, I mean, of course, this whole idea of receptive fields and convolutional neural network with local interaction. That, I guess, is something that came from neuroscience. But other than that, most of the, I guess, the big ideas, or maybe also reinforcement learning. But there's not been too many ideas coming from neuro in
No,
going into the AI at the
yeah,
last years. But this could be maybe an example of that in the future.
yeah. I mean, I think it remains. I think it's very, as you said, like right now, the AI is moving at such a fast pace, and
Mm,
it's being very, very successful.
mm,
And most people working in AI right now don't necessarily believe that the
mm,
brain is going to be the way to like get us to
mm,
AGI,
mm.
right?
Yeah.
There's a smaller minority that believe that
Mm,
it's going to be important too, but I
mm,
think it's going to be challenging to figure out ways
mm,
that neuroscience is going to help AI.
mm,
However, there could be a lot of things. For example, the fact that these data sets, if we were to be able to understand the neural code
mm,
and understood, have an interpretable neural network versus a non-interpretable one, then everyone's going to go for the interpretability here.
mm,
So I
mm.
think that area, it's a lot of fruitful interactions between neuroscience and
Yeah.
AI there,
Mm,
because It's about understanding, you know, in interpretable, in mechanistic interpretability, basically this area.
mm,
The
mm,
other one is generalization and energy efficiency, because if you have a neural network that can never generalize very well, and you always have to train it more and more and more, and we're running out of data, and you come up with a way that it can learn much
mm.
more efficiently, and it shows signs that, I mean, it has to be a big effect, like generalizes better, let's say with the cow and the beach,
Yeah. Sort of
right?
like humans do.
Like
Less
humans
data.
do,
Yeah.
then of course you know you're combining
Mm,
human level of intelligence
mm,
more with brute force, large scale data, and large energy consumption by GPUs, and that may get to a super intelligence that is much stronger than the current path
mm,
towards AGI by
mm,
big tech.
mm,
But that remains to be determined, and I would say, right now it's a race, and
mm.
nobody has much time to stop and like
Exactly.
alternative ways, since they think they're like moving
Yeah, and I guess
ahead,
it's they're
right?
worried about being left behind because they
Exactly.
know they have this one track that has a high chance of success, even though it might saturate. But
Exactly.
so then you don't have to think
But
about.
this is often happens in science and
Yeah,
technology, right? Everybody
uh,
they get into a rat race, and then an
mm,
outsider usually comes.
yeah,
They stumble, and
mm,
because they're too big and too successful, they may not be as
mm,
nimble in like changing their strategy as the other person
mm,
that is coming from the outside. That
mm.
is, of course, taking a much higher risk, right?
Yeah. So back to the your mouse project. I mean, I guess now your foundation model has focused on like the visual cortex, not just primary visual cortex, but also higher visual areas in the mouse. And then are you going to increase the number of modalities? And, is that the direction that you're interested in going, or?
Yeah, I think what we want to do now is, I mean, all this stuff was passively viewing the
Mm,
mice, right?
mm,
The mice were not engaged in any task. And, we want to start getting data where mice are engaged in more active behaviors, like
mm,
freely moving mice. And ideally, like build, with colleagues where we gather enough data and we start building foundation models that are
mm,
more multimodal, and they include a lot of data from
mm,
different tasks.
mm,
That's one direction. The other direction, of course, is trying to link it to diseases, right? Like start building like maybe foundation model of disease states. And in
mm,
mice, this is a big advantage because we have a lot of animal models of diseases that are even,
mm, mm.
transgenic models that I think brings in a new powerful approach.
But what about data? Because I mean now, because you do mainly recordings from like the superficial part of the brain, and where it can be reached with optical imaging. So, and I guess also if you want to go move on to humans, how then to getting well, then the data will be very different. Then
Yes.
the approach must be different.
I think there would, to go deep, we will use technologies like depth electrodes, like neuropixels,
Okay.
that enable you to go as deep. They're building, I'm building neuropixels for humans and monkeys that can go as deep as any brain structure,
Mm,
you
mm,
know, like centimeters long. So they
mm,
can go very deep into the brain.
mm. What about
Um,
like photo? I mean, optical techniques with fibers and lenses and prisms and
Yeah,
stuff.
there is green lenses. There's other methods like
Yeah.
using mini scopes or endoscopes. I mean,
Yeah.
I think all these tools are going to be used. I think
Mm,
depends on the question and how do you want to do it, chronic, non-chronic. Do you care about getting individual spikes?
yeah.
If you care about temporal codes, do
Yeah.
you go down to the individual spiking
Mm,
level, right? But all these are like, I think we're going to see a plethora or a diversity of approaches and methods and data collection.
mm,
To I think what is critical here is to build this foundation model, you have to embrace a very not classical view of doing experiments in neuroscience, which is not hypothesis driven but data driven,
mm,
which means you have to go for large high entropy stimuli and behaviors, right?
mm,
If you want to study, let's say, the motor system, you can't just like train an animal to go have a lever that goes forward backward, right? You need to
Mm,
like study naturalistic behaviors to
mm.
build a foundation model that mimics the complexity of that system you want to study.
Yeah, cool. And human brains. That must be something very different, I presume.
The human brain, yeah, the
Yeah,
human brain, again, neuropixels can be applied there.
yeah, that's true.
But you're right that the data will always be much sparser there,
Mm, mm,
right? So essentially, but one nice thing here is,
mm,
and this remains to be determined to what extent it will work well, but you could build baseline foundation models, let's say forecasting models of spiking activity to learn the spiking dynamics. And
mm,
then you could fine tune it to sparser human data, but these models
mm.
may be built on monkey data, let's
I
say,
see. Yeah,
or have way
yeah,
more data.
yeah. Cool. Well, I think this is very exciting, Andreas, and thanks a lot for spending your Christmas vacation, or
Yeah,
one morning of your Christmas vacation with your family to talk to me, talk with me about this. So, anyways, thanks a lot for coming.
thank you. Thank you, and have a nice holiday and a happy new year. And I hope to see you soon in person.
Absolutely, likewise.
Thank you. Bye.